Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first ever Red Talks podcast series featuring Dr. Alex Redcorn. This program is part of Democracy and the Informed Citizen initiative administered by the Federal State Humanities Council. The initiative seeks to deepen the public's knowledge and appreciation of vital connections between democracy, the humanities, journalism, and informed citizenry. We would like to thank the Andrew W. Melvin Foundation for their generous support of this initiative and the Pulitzer prizes for their partnership. So before we begin, I would like to kind of have Dr. Alex Redcorn kind of introduce himself to kind of people who aren't familiar with him and what he does. So Dr. Redcorn, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, it sounds real formal getting a Dr. Redcorn, but I appreciate it. My name is Alex Redcorn. I'm a citizen of the Osage Nation, and my family is from the Wahakalian district in the Osage Nation. I work for Kansas State University, where I also graduated. I graduated from KU first, but my doctorate's from Kansas State University, and that's also where I work now, where I'm assistant professor of educational leadership. I'm also the executive director of the Kansas Association for Native American Education, and I'm also the coordinator for Indigenous partnerships there. I do some methods work there as well, but those are probably the most relevant things for this conversation. So, I really appreciate you. I appreciate you inviting me on and letting me talk to you here today.
Yeah, definitely. And I know everything's pretty busy, especially being an academic. So can you kind of talk about your dissertation and what you worked on and how that is applicable to what you're doing now?
Yeah, so it's kind of hard to talk about the dissertation without talking a little bit about my backstory. So I'm a citizen of the Osage Nation, and my family's from Pawhuska, Oklahoma, and we lived in Pawhuska, for a while, which is the Wahakalian district of the Osage Nation. And we lived in Pawhuska. My family was from there, and in elementary school, we moved up to the suburbs of Kansas City for the sake of improved schools and job opportunities. And so when we did that, we spent a lot of my life from later elementary school through middle and high school going back and forth between the reservation in Oklahoma and the quote unquote economic opportunities in the suburbs. And so we spent a lot of time going back and forth. And so I got my teaching degree from KU. And so after I got my teaching degree, because I had met my now wife in the community, we stayed in the community, in the suburban community of Kansas City. And the reason that's all relevant is because my dissertation was kind of about that, about negotiating like mainstream schools when you have these connections to a community. And so it's all about kind of the negotiation of mainstream schools. At the same time, I became a social studies teacher in those schools, and I really didn't quite connect indigeneity and education very well. And so when I started doing research in graduate school, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to connect my professional life better with my personal life. And so the dissertation is kind of about my own journey navigating between mainstream education and trying to bridge over to Indigenous studies and Indigenous education.
So with your focus in social studies and getting into education, was that the one thing that, when you grew up, you always wanted to be, or was there, an alternate career path, maybe in a parallel universe where Alex Redcorn, maybe General Redcorn or something, you know what I mean? So did you have any alternate, kind of career path that you wanted to take?
Oh yeah. So being in, ever since high school, I played guitar growing up, and me and my brother Ryan were in a couple bands together, and I really wanted to be a musician. And so we played in metal bands together that you could barely understand the lyrics, and we had a lot of fun, and it was a great time. But somewhere along the lines, I started, I was also involved in wrestling. I was heavily involved in wrestling. So I had a passion for music, I had a passion for wrestling, and my passion for wrestling kind of translated into coaching, which translated into education. Your stereotypical social studies teacher is a coach in something, right? And so I was that kind of stereotype, except coaching is what got me into education, and then education kind of took the lead, and coaching ended up eventually kind of taking a back seat to it because I went to graduate school to kind of dive deeper into education, and education and coaching are entwined. But basically, yeah, I stopped coaching and got deeper into education over time. But yeah, music, I was just talking to my daughter about this the other day. Like, I really wanted to go on a tour with the band, and we played quite a bit of shows, and we had a good time. But eventually, it came time to, you know what, I'm going to get a teaching degree, so I should probably go teach.
Well, I think a lot of kids and people my age are probably benefiting from your expertise too. So we're thankful for that too. So, um, growing up in Pawhuska, uh, being an Osage, there's a lot of talks, especially today, especially with like the racial disparities in our climate. So, can you kind of talk about kind of the history and the background about Pawhuska in itself? I know there's there's blood stains everywhere. You know what I mean? That's pretty much everywhere in America.
Yeah.
But Pawhuska is particularly interesting too because of the book Killers of the Flower Moon.
Yeah.
And so, could you kind of just provide some of your expertise from somebody actually being from there, growing up there, and having that a part of your identity?
Yeah, and I also had to like kind of be careful about like growing up there because I spent a whole lot of time there. But in elementary school, from elementary school on, I visited a lot, and sometimes that meant lots of the summer. And so I spent a lot of time there. But Tusk is part of my home, but I need to kind of be careful about that, the phrase growing up there. But yeah, I consider it like kind of it's my second home really.
Hmm.
Yeah, so Pawhuska is an oil boom town, and the Osages are an oil tribe, and the history that comes with it. I don't think you have enough time to dive into it in this podcast, but it's long and complicated. And at the core of it is growing up in a community where lots lots of white folks came in and exploited the system to take advantage of Osage wealth, and that included murdering Osages after marrying them, after finding a way to legally have access to their estate, to their yes, to their land, to their estate, to everything else. And
Yeah.
so that's the backdrop of a lot of things. That's really interesting. Things you don't hear a lot of people talk. It's even more complicated when you think about the pioneer woman setting up a shop there, which brings business and things like that. But at the same time, there's this backdrop of land dispossession that can be intertwined with that because um, yes. But anyway, without going too far into that, basically it's believed that my great grandfather was it was never proven, but it's believed that he was kind of caught up in some of that as well. And so my grandfather, it's actually really interesting because my grandfather was born in 1911, I believe, and he lived through he lived through it all. He was a teenager watching all that unfold, where you have these people marrying into the tribe and exploiting tribal members and killing tribal members for their money. Um, and then he also lived all the way into seeing my brothers and I go to college
Wow.
into the 2000s, and watching us go to college, get degrees, and try to find ways to start contributing to the community or reaching back to the community. And I always think about that because there's so many layers that you can kind of analyze. But my brother Ryan talks a lot about how his story of survivance is kind of an interesting one because he saw it all unfold, but yet at the same time he's at the other end of it as watching his grandchildren grow older. And he grew up in a house where Osage was spoken as a first language, and then once his grandfather and his father died, from what I understand, it started to fade a little bit. And then here he is, fast forward, going and buying language CDs and audio tapes to help his grandkids learn the language. And I wouldn't even consider myself a speaker, but my brother Ryan took it and he kind of ran with it. And so, like, that idea of survivance and steps forward, he's kind of a living story of that. And so
Yeah.
he's a living story that connects us with that past. And I think it's an important one that backdropped a lot of our life, really.
Yeah, definitely. So, it's great that you bring up your brother, and you have other brothers too. Um, how many of them went to KU? Was it just
Is all of us.
it was all of
Uh,
us, yeah. So the title of this podcast is called Abundance of Opportunity, and it's to explore, the segment of Lawrence, Kansas being that platform for helping Native Americans, Alaskan Natives and Native Hawaiians coming here and then going on to do great things. And so when you mentioned that, they all went to go do great things, and how much of Lawrence in itself was a platform for your career to kind of take off to what it is when you first got
well,
here?
well, I appreciate that. I mean, so the it's kind of incredible how so much of it, I mean, not all of it, but so much of it can funnel back to um, a handful of very influential people. But for us, and I can't speak for my brothers, but I
Mhm.
would imagine they would agree, a lot of it revolves around the influence of Cornell Peabody when he was at KU. So Cornell Peabody is a leader in Indigenous education topics, and he was actually in the College of Education while I was there, and I actually never had him in class, but he was the sponsor for the First Nations Student Association. And it's kind of funny, as we were kind of getting ready to start this conversation, I remember you said something about that. It'll be a little bit about Lawrence, and I started thinking like, okay, and I started looking around me, and I got Haskell paraphernalia on my desk, and then I don't know if you can
I
see
know,
in the
I got
back.
one right here. I got a career fair thing,
Yeah,
so
I got that one too, right there. We were both there that day. So I got that type of stuff. But then I also, I don't know if you can see in the background there, that's the KU powwow poster.
okay.
And Ryan actually made that. That's a silk screen poster of it. So Ryan was in graphic design. That was kind of what he was doing. So Ryan actually made that. And then I was sitting here right before we started, and I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting too, because um, I got this right here sitting here, and it was
Well, that's awesome.
we hosted the Big 12 American Indian Leadership Conference as the First Nations Student Association, and I got outstanding senior of the year. And that really that was a really important year for me, because when I first started college, I was like, just like, hey, I'm going to go to classes and do my thing, and I'm going to go practice with my band, and then I'm going to go just kind of putz around town. And then as I got older, I got more involved, and the fulfillment and the enjoyment I got of getting more involved was, I just really enjoyed it. And Cornell Peabody is behind all that. He was the First Nations Student Association sponsor. He invited us to his house. We ate fry bread, ham and beans, and sang around the drum, and he taught us songs, and he helped us get involved. Heck, he was probably the one that nominated me for this award, and who knows, maybe I was the only person who was nominated. That's why I got it. But it still matters,
Yeah.
because it influenced our connectivity. Even when you're kind of, even when Haskell's right there, you're still at KU, and KU is a pretty big institution. It enhanced our connectivity to the American Indian community. And growing up in the suburbs, it was, uh, I mean, there wasn't a whole lot of Indians around. And actually, a funny thing is, we happened to move in right next door to some, so that was kind of funny. But other than that, they were nowhere to be found.
Yeah.
So yeah, that connectivity that I found through the influence of Cornell Peabody, um, and the advocacy of him was really, really powerful and long lasting, because, like I said, when I started going to teach, I didn't talk to Cornell as much, but I stayed in contact. And then after 7 years of teaching, when I got a grad school itch, being like, I want to research not just social studies, American Indian education systems. Um, First person I called, my advisors couldn't help me. They were good advisors, they were nice people, but they didn't have that background skill set to know, who do I talk to, what are the authors, what are the scholars. And I called Cornell Peabody, and he's like, oh, you need to talk to Quentin Romanos. And Quentin Romanos works with the Tribal Education Department of the National Assembly. And I spent countless hours talking to Quentin on the phone, when I didn't know what I was supposed to be reading and where I was supposed to be looking. But he actually, those two helped me crack into the complicated network of what is American Indian education systems, and not just mainstream education systems.
Mhm.
And so that really was the launching pad that took me into the graduate program. And they introduced me to people, and my network grew from them based on their expertise.
Yeah, so can you kind of talk about that American Indian Leadership Conference that you brought to KU? When I was in FINSA, First Nation Student Association, there was nothing like that. You know what I mean? There was actually minimal effort to support our club at the time. I always tell people it went in waves. You know, you had those really trailblazing students, and then they graduate, and then nothing happens, and then they got another set of students coming in because you graduated in 2005, correct? Is that
Yes.
what it was? And then so in 2012, I came walking on campus looking confused as hell. You know what I mean? So, but can you kind of talk about that? Because that's kind of a pretty important thing. And I know KU back then they did have a leadership symposium, but it was back in like 2015 and it was for like high school students. But it was good, but it wasn't as effective. You know what I mean? And so, could you kind of explain the process of that and like what it took? Was there any backlash? You know what I mean? Was there people just not supportive of it? You know what I mean? Just kind of the process in itself. I can kind of see how that fits in the mold of like powwows. And that's a whole nother conversation too, because I'm pretty sure that you guys had some problems as well. But yeah, kind of talk about that American Indian Leadership Conference, because that's really interesting.
Yeah, so it was the Big 12 American Indian Leadership Conference, and from what I understand, it used to rotate around Big 12 schools. And so the Native American student organizations in different Big 12 schools would take it up and become the host, and it would rotate around. And I don't know how consistently it was rotating around, but I specifically remember in a FINSA meeting the year before we had it, and Cornell asking like, "Hey, this idea came up. So maybe somebody pitched it to him, or maybe he thought of it. I can't remember, but he's like, would we enjoy the opportunity to host the Big 12 American Indian Leadership Conference?" And we all decided, yeah, we're going to do it. And we had enough people in the room, and he made it very clear. He said, if we're going to do this, like you can't half do this. Like you have to show up. We
It's a
have to
full
all like
send.
stick to our responsibilities, execute our responsibilities in order to make this happen. And we put a lot of work into it. And it was basically, I mean, I attribute it to his leadership along with the capacity in the organization. Because I've worked with enough students and educational institutions now as an educator to know, like, if you don't have your capacity to execute ideas is inherently connected to how many interested and engaged students you have,
Mhm.
because you can mentor them to do certain things, but a student organization should be led by the students.
Yeah.
And so we just happen to have a collection of people. I mean, it's kind of interesting, like when at that time, I mean, it was me and two of my brothers. I think Ryan had graduated by then, and another Osage, Avis Ballard. You also had, um, I mean, there's going to be people that I don't name, but Ruben Littlehead was there. I think he was in a graduate program there at the time, and Myron Dewey was there, and I think he was in the graduate program too. And so there was just a handful of people who were ready to do something. And the Big 12 Leadership Conference, we basically put it together, got a keynote. I remember the keynote was the chief of the Osage Nation at the time, Jim Gray. And we were in the process of reforming our government at the time. He was the keynote. It wasn't a massive conference or anything, but we had several groups of people come in from everywhere from Creighton, University of Nebraska Lincoln, Oklahoma University, Oklahoma State University, obviously Haskell, and more. And so that was like an eye-opening thing for me about the influence of an event. And I think one key thing I took from that is when I found an opportunity at K-State to replicate something that I knew we could do, we started the Indigenous Peoples Day Conference.
Yeah.
And that's really been a catalyst for other things to happen at K-State. And so yeah, that to connect then to now as well. That's, I think, for me, in my perspective, my idea at a K-State Indigenous Faculty Staff Alliance meeting of, hey, why don't we host a small conference? It turned into that all stems from that experience there at KU.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And I know a lot of people, when you guys had that Indigenous Peoples Day conference last year, a lot of people from Lawrence, bussed over there. I think my mom went, or she was talking about going. But I think that's interesting, that, you know, Manhattan and Kansas State, really made a push for that effort, and it almost was baffling because I was like, well, where's the energy that KU has? You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so I think that's pretty unique. But so as an undergraduate, doing that, which is an amazing accomplishment, um, how many powwows did you help manage, during your time at FINSA?
I would say I was, like I said early on, I was peripheral engaged. I wasn't as like gung ho about being an active student on campus until my older years, and so I would help out here and there with the power. We had one every year,
Yeah.
but yeah, I would help out with the early ones, like day of type stuff, and do a little bit leading up to. But I was definitely more involved because that conference was hitched to a powwow as well. So the powwow was the final day of the conference, or like the last one of the last days of the conference, or something like that. And so it was kind of a culminating activity was attached to it. And so um, yeah, I was more involved that
Now,
year.
now, was it your group or cohort of students that you were with that was experiencing extreme difficulty with the university one year? Was that, or was that a year before, a year after? I don't know, because I know there was an instance where students had to have the powwow off campus due to a dispute. You know what I mean? And so, were you a part of that situation?
So those are the years I was kind of peripheral involved.
Okay.
It, there was a handful of things that just always seemed to happen. It was never a clean execution, and not because of like our end, but there was
Yeah.
always a hiccup somewhere where, for example, like traditional ideas of paying people, and not just paying people, but offering gifts, things like that, kind of hit snags in university bureaucracy. How you show appreciation to student ed dancers versus the incoming dancers, things like that. Just the traditions of like exchanging things, money or gifts, like tended to always strike a nerve. And then facilities was like this ongoing conversation that just seemed to never end. So
Yeah.
it was in, I think, Robinson Gym. I don't even know if is Robinson Gym still there, or was
The
that
Robinson Gym's still there and it's still hot. You know what I mean? So,
yeah, so it was in Robinson Gym, but then it was in Anschutz Complex, and it was never in Allen Fieldhouse, and that wasn't even an option that was
yeah.
ever on the table. And now, since we left, obviously it's in the Lead Center, things like that. And so, yeah, it there was just always something, and it just felt like that was actually in. And I actually feel bad about this now, but I think as an as a younger person, and this is kind of how powerful this stuff can be as a deterrent. As a younger person, like a freshman or sophomore in college, where I'm just like looking to learn a little bit and kind of go about my business, I I just didn't have the appetite for going and fighting people on political stages, university politics, campus politics, and things like that. And so it was actually kind of like that might be one of the things that kind of pushed me away from fence a little bit. And it it kind of like angers me a little bit to think about that as like an older person talking to a younger person, like my own self.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also the university being like, this is what you're doing when you do this stuff, like you make it not enjoyable for people. And so things like that kind
That's
of stuck
crazy.
with me. But then over time, i I got engaged, and I couldn't help but like start speaking up more and more. So
Yeah, and so that still lingered to when I got to KU in 2012. Like it was crazy because I remember, especially when we were planning that they were asking us, to pay insurance as a student organization. It was like $1,000 at the time, and it was ridiculous because I was like, man, like we're a student organization, we're paying into this institution already. Yes, people are coming outside, but you don't have people who are walking into Allen Fieldhouse sign a waiver, you know what I mean, who are watching a
mhm.
basketball game, you know what I mean? And so it was very, very unique and perplexing. And I remember we had to actually cancel it one year, and I was the president, so I felt like an extreme failure. But that stuff lingered, and that ultimately caught on to stakeholders in the university, such as Derek Kwan, who stepped up to the mantle and was like, "Hey, we see you, we understand your frustrations. What can we do to help?" And they offered the Lead Center. Now, natives, they're not going to be happy with anything. And so they always found some way to get mad. And, there was people that were against it, but it was just really unique because it was like, well, if you understood from our situation, you would say that, hey, we're not paying a single dime, because we had to pay as a student organization $1,000 to rent out Robinson Gymnasium. And I thought that was crazy as well too. And so, but the powwow is good. And I remember one specific instance, I think since 2014, the budget was like $2,400. It was really just kind of like dinky, like a one-dayer, 80, 60, 40 first place. Just giving something to the dancers that are taking their time out of their day to come. Maybe they felt sorry for us, who knows. But from that instance, from 2014 to 2017, with the lead center's involvement, that budget grew tenfold, and it went from 2,400 to over 24,000. And so that was through the institutional opportunity and access and people kind of understanding. But it was just kind of crazy because I was like, man, like this shouldn't be that difficult. But that kind of helped my career. So how it fits with this kind of whole topic with the abundance of opportunity. So after you left KU, what was next for Alex Redcorn and his career endeavor?
Yeah. So first off, I appreciate those comments because it's like, once again, you had one person step up and didn't resist everything, just said, I think I have a solution and I'd like to help you with it. And
Yeah,
in a position of power. And it's incredible what that can do. Because
definitely.
that is what sometimes is missing is people don't know what they're uh, keeping suppressed by sticking so I don't know, not being willing to like look outside of their own context, I guess is
Yeah.
kind of an issue. So because that actually intersects with kind of where I ended up. So basically I went and taught in Shawnee Mission schools. I taught high school geography. After I graduated, I went and taught high school geography, and actually I taught lots of social studies topics, economics, U.S. history, U.S. government, things like that for 7 years. And so I was doing that while my wife was going to KU Med. So my wife was also at KU, and then she went to KU Medical School in Kansas City. And so I was working. She was full-time medical student, and then she started a residency in Kansas City at Children's Mercy Hospital. So we stayed in Kansas City area for 7 years while I was teaching. And then as she finished and started looking for jobs coming out of her program, I was actually finishing up my master's at the same time. And so I started looking around and I was like, I really had this itch, like, because I started it in my master's. That's when I called Cornell and he introduced me to Quentin Romanos. And I got introduced to TEDNA, the Tribal Ed Department National Assembly, and some folks around there. And I just started I had lots of questions. And so I had this itch to kind of I wouldn't call it a next step. Just like I said, connect my professional and personal life. It wasn't like I'm going to climb a ladder. It's just like I'd look for something. I had an itch, 7-year itch, I guess. Um, and so in that moment, I started shopping around to, not shopping around, just asking around is probably a more appropriate way of saying it. I started asking around about doctoral programs, and I had this kind of grandeur vision of what the doctorate is and could be. And most people who start a doctorate don't totally understand exactly what that means until they're dang near finished with it. And
Yeah.
so, really, I sent emails to some folks. I went and talked to some people at KU. I talked to folks at Baker. I talked to some folks, maybe somewhere else, but I actually emailed K State, and my wife had a job prospect out west, and I got an immediate response. And the department chair was very eager. He said, I'd really highly encourage you to apply to our program. And so I did. And so it's kind of incredible. It doesn't mean I didn't get a response from KU, but the folks at K State were like, no, we'd love to have you and we want to help you. And so that just kind of struck me. And I never in my wildest dreams ever thought I'd go over to K State for a doctorate. But there it was just sitting right in front of me. So I said, all right, let's do it. And I didn't want to be doing my doctorate for like 9 years. It actually took me 8 years to finish my master's. And so I thought, I'm going to do this full time. I'm going to go in, be a full-time student, and not try to like chip away at a doctorate forever, because it'll never happen if I do that.
Mhm.
so I joined full time, and because of that, I was able to engage in the university, get graduate assistant positions, become an adjunct professor, and at a local college, a small college, do some things like that. But in allowing myself to engage in the university at K State, one day I was sitting there and I said to my the department chair, I said, "Hey, we really are missing the ball on training educators for work in Indian country." And I had a map of all the TCUs, the tribal colleges and universities, and I looked at it, and I looked at every um, opportunity to become a certified trained educator amongst the tribal colleges and universities in the region. And Haskell is the only one that had one, and it was an elementary degree. I couldn't go to Haskell to get my social studies secondary or my high school social studies degree. That wasn't an option at Haskell. And so I said, like, hey, I'd like to visit with you, because he's a former superintendent. He's been in higher education. He's an ed finance expert kind of guy, Dr. Thompson. And he goes, well, let's talk to the dean about it. And I was like, what? And so 3 days later, I had a meeting with the dean, and then a day later, I had a job offer to do full-time work for coordinating with tribes and tribal communities. And that just happened because they saw somebody who had engaged with American Indian communities, kind of better understood it. And then all of a sudden, I got a job. And I got a job doing something I didn't know would actually exist when I finished my doctorate. I just knew that I wanted to kind of engage in tribal capacity building from an educator training standpoint.
Mhm.
So, long story short, I got a job, and then all of a sudden, full time, I'm working with people on campus, trying to create programming, trying to create a more culturally responsive environment, because I knew as somebody who went to KU, K State had an image problem in Indian country.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily like bad. It was just kind of like, I don't know what's going on over there. Nothing.
Just disassociated, basically.
Yeah. And so I had this job opportunity, but I knew that I was working in an institution that needed a campus wide kind of, I wouldn't call it branding, but needed some help. And
Yeah.
so I went and started looking for other natives on campus and found them. And to circle back around how you were talking about one person that said, hey, I want to give you an opportunity. I'm going to open this door up and give you free range to kind of do what you know needs to be done. That's essentially what they did at K-State for me. And I haven't hit really any major institutional roadblocks. We just started doing things, and people were like, nobody's been doing this. And so, yes, keep doing more of that, because when administrators show up and the room's packed full of people, you got a keynote speaker and they're standing room only, they know that something's going on. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm kind of talking too long, but that's,
Oh, that's awesome. So I like to coin that term, and I wrote it in a paper in college as deliberative action. You know what I mean? Just taking the initiative, going straight for it, but them also being cognizant of where their faults laid. You know what I mean? They knew that they weren't going to, even if they did make an effort without you, it maybe might have seemed as disingenuous, you know what I mean, or perceived to others as not like, oh, okay, what's K-State trying to do? You know what I mean? And so I think
mhm.
that's pretty intense, because just recently, I just saw that a good friend of ours, relative, Carrie Whitlow, KK Franklin, she's actually attending the program now too. Now, did you have something to do? Did you recruit her, or was that on her own whim? Because I was
So
like, man, I was like, she went to K State, but again, that's just the whole KU K State rivalry thing, though. So
that's actually, I don't know if I recruited her, but I went down to, because over time meeting with people like Quentin Romanos and that network that built off of that. So a lot of people associated with Tribal Education Department National Assembly, I've continued to do work with them. And so between Quentin and people that work with TEDNA, I got invited to do a presentation at a conference in Oklahoma City, or not Oklahoma City, at OU. And so I did this presentation at OU. And what I didn't say, because I was talking too long in the previous question, is at K-State, I built a partnership program with the Osage Nation to do ed leadership training. So I go to Oklahoma, and I go to Oklahoma, and I have a cohort of Osage people working in education jobs, getting a master's degree in educational leadership through K-State. And so yeah, that was going on. So I went to go present on that at OU, and there, I believe it was there, I met Carrie, and she started asking questions. And I was like, we also have an adult learning and leadership. So there's an ed leadership degree, and we also have an adult learning and leadership degree. And so I said, if you can, I mean, I'm not good at recruiting, but I'm like, I'm not a recruiter, but if you want to take a program like this, I'm going to be in there in the institution to help you navigate as much as you can, because what people do not understand is with the doctorate when they start is if you don't have somebody that knows indigenous education, critical indigenous philosophy, or a knowledge of what American Indian education is, you have to go outside of all your mentors and peers. You have to go outside of the institution to find your information.
Yeah.
And so, because there's this expectation that you'll just naturally, get it, but you have to go outside. And so I told her I'd help her, but yeah, she just got started, and we actually I rolled her on to help me write a chapter, and she got a co-authorship right out of the gates, a chapter on tribal education departments that hopefully that's still moving forward. It's being reviewed right now. So
Mhm. Yeah, and she's doing a lot of good things for the Cheyenne Arapaho Education Department. They've had a lot of governor turnovers, and
mhm.
especially with tribal politics, it's pretty polarizing. But with her though, her and her family be able to stay consistent. So that shows you something. You know what I mean? To be able to be a part of that transition and stuff too. So, well, that's pretty impressive. That's amazing. So now they let you do free reign basically. I remember that discussion that we had at Lawrence Beer Company, where you were talking about how you were able to just do what you want basically on your terms. So how is that freedom, you know what I mean, that just that education, the academic freedom to kind of go about and venture out and and write stuff and define stuff on your terms too? So how does that feel, especially as a native man, you know what I mean, and in a system, in a space that isn't accommodating for us, basically.
Well, I tell you, the freedom that my institution, especially my department chair, and actually he's retiring, so a new department chair is coming. The freedom my department chairs and my dean have given me has just been really liberating. I mean, it allows me, because I also, like I said, I do work in methods, and so it allows me to push critical indigenous methodologies when doing research that also are non-traditional. And so, like, when I say non-traditional in the context of traditional academic research, so
Yeah.
there's some boundary pushing that I'm allowed to do there because I'm also managing the qualitative methods program. And that I inherited from my old major professor, who I always joke around, she's Indian, but different type of India, South Asia Indian, but she's still the one that pushed me into critical indigenous methodologies when I was just kind of wandering around and like, yeah, okay, I want to work with Indian education systems. She's like, you got to go a little bit deeper than that. And so she actually, I credit a lot of work that she did with me and with my progress at K-State. Um, but the freedom in academia is liberating. It's really awesome. At the same time, sometimes existing structure is nice. And so when you're challenging structures and trying to create new structures, you have to build it as you go.
Yeah.
And that's a little bit different than when I first got out of college and I walked into a world geography classroom, a ninth grade world geography classroom. They handed me a textbook, handed me the curriculum, and said, here you go, here's your computer, here, just do this and we'll send the kids will show up, here's your rosters. And so in creating systems of education to work more appropriate for and with native communities, you have to do a lot of building, and you don't just get to show up and do your teaching,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
It's a lot of trust too.
Yes. And so you have to change that culture over time, and you have to change the systemic structures or build
Yeah.
them as you go.
Well, that's amazing. You've had a great career. We're still pretty young. I don't see any gray hairs yet. So, and you have a lifelong life ahead of you. You know what I mean, for whatever else to accomplish. So, before we wrap up, can you kind of just talk about on some ending remarks on what's next for Dr. Redcorn? What kind of projects, if you can disclose some stuff, maybe, and how COVID-19 has either helped or hindered your ability. For me, it's personally helped me because I'm working on my website, and if I didn't have that discipline to be at home at the entire time, my website wouldn't look as nice as it is now. And so it makes me like kind of bump myself on the head being like, dude, I could have did this, the entire time. But so what is that for you though, as we kind of wrap this up? What's kind of, on the radar for you, some stuff. And what have you noticed, because academia and our lives are basically going to be forever changed after this pandemic, you know what I mean? And so how is that kind of impacting your ability now to move forward, if it is hindering or not?
Well, so first off, the couple big projects I got going on right now, the Kansas Nebraska Indian Education Study. So we got a grant from the Kansas Health Foundation to do some research on Kansas and Nebraska in partnership with Nebraska for Indian education, and it's a pretty open-ended project where we're basically trying to identify all the key Indian education stakeholders across the state. Um, because it's we realize that we need to be better connected. We need to be able to break people out of their silos. Like if you're a Title VI Indian education director in a small rural school in rural Kansas, like you may not realize the resources that are sitting down the highway or that are sitting one Zoom call away. And so it's called the Kansas Nebraska Indian Education Study and Community Building Project, and that's through our work with the revival of Kansas Association for Native American Education. So we revived the Kansas Association for Native American Education, which is CONAE, which went dormant a long time ago, but we revived that organization. We've been rebuilding that professional community. And this is really one of our first big projects, is to do this study, because we find that a lot of Native folks, Native educators in Kansas don't necessarily have the needs assessment data they need to go apply for grants. And so not only are they disconnected from people who can help, when you go apply for a grant, you need to establish some sort of need. And so we're hoping to create a report where we can say, this is what we know about Kansas Indian education, and here's where some issues are. And so if we can publicize that for them through in an organized way, it will actually open up access to resources for people. Plus, it's things that can infiltrate teacher education training programs and professional development programs for teachers across the state and more. And we're doing it in partnership with Nebraska, because we realize Kansas and Nebraska, our counterparts who have been reviving a Nebraska Indian Education Association, we have a similar profile as states, with how many Title VI programs we have, how many BIE institutions we have, and things like that. And so we just thought, hey, if we're going to build community, let's build community together. And so we've been trying to do that together. So that's one of the big projects. I also have a couple articles I'm working on. One's about it's a model for building tribal capacity from the tribal governance standpoint out. And so it's this idea that sovereignty is nice. I mean, we have sovereignty. We can do a lot with sovereignty, right? But
Yeah.
in education, you can only do as much as your skill sets allow you to do. So it's focusing on like, okay, you're as a tribe, if you want to build your sovereignty, we need to focus on how the systems work for us or against us, and bending the systems to work for sovereignty. And at the same time, you need professionals and knowledgeable people to enact that sovereignty. If you don't have the professionals and the knowledgeable people in the right place, then your sovereignty is just an idea that you legally have the capacity to take advantage of, but you can't actually take advantage of it. So I'm working on a model to conceptualize how we can build sovereignty over time in education specifically.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a lot of great and powerful stuff that you're doing, and we appreciate you on the front lines, especially in your space where your expertise is definitely needed and valued. So, before we wrap up again, is for the kids who are watching this, do you have any is there any internship opportunities available? Do you know of, from Kenya or K-State or something? Maybe we can drop a link on when we post this, but just kind of on the radar, just so before the following year, if there's any.
Oh yeah, so there's plenty of opportunities at K State, and especially there's always opportunities to engage with the Kansas Association for Native American Education. That's not a K State only organization. That's only housed at K State
Yeah.
because I'm there and it's convenient. And so anything with that, mainly what I would say is my inbox is always open, and if people want to send me a question to ask or just say like, hey, I'm thinking about this, I have a school that I think you should reach out to, or I have a son that's thinking about going to K-State, or I have a son that's thinking about going into teaching, because I don't care if our Indian educators go to K-State, go to KU, go to Haskell, go to Emporia State. They need to get in there and they need to remember who they are and realize that our education systems don't always train us to work with our own communities. And so to keep that intellectual piece in place, even if the institution keeps telling you to not. And so, and the way I talk about it is there's always a recentering that needs to happen, and keeping your identity as an Indigenous person at the center of what you do, not just personally. You don't have to shed it when you walk through the school or become a teacher. Like, you can keep it front and center. And so encouraging people to do that as they go through our systems of education is one of my key
Definitely.
talking points.
So as we wrap it up, I just wanted to say thanks again, Dr. Redcorn, for allowing you to come here and talk and share your story and your experiences and what you've been doing so far. Unfortunate that we weren't able to do this in person. I'm a little salty because next week my powwow would be happening, but things happen for a reason though. And
Yeah.
so Dr. Redcorn, thanks again. My name is Freddie Gipp. I'm the CEO of Lead Horse LLC. This program was the Red Talks podcast titled Abundance of Opportunity, sponsored by Mini Moccasins Incorporated, Lead Horse LLC, and Humanities Kansas. So have a good night. Take care, and I'll see you in person sometime soon. Maybe we get a burger again too. So,
Will do. Let's
all
do
right.
it.
All right. Take care.
All right. Take care. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.